Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for coming. My name is Ramona Naddaff, and I'm a professor in the Rhetoric Department and director of the Art of Writing program at the Townsend Center for the Humanities. And I'm just going to say the Art of Writing hasn't hosted its annual lecture since 2019. So it's a tremendous pleasure today to recommence our annual lecture series with the economist and author Sonali Deraniyagala. She has taken time to travel and to speak with us today about the process and art of writing of her 2013 best-selling, award-winning Way. So, since we haven't had a lecture for a really long time, forgive me while I thank many people. Um, Many people are to thanks for making these lectures possible. Present and past deans of the arts and humanities, present and past directors, some of whom are here today, present of the directors of the Townsend Center for the Humanities, and present and past teams of the Art of Writing and of the Townsend Center. And I want to thank the many faculty, graduate, and undergraduate students from a wide range of campus departments who, since 2016, have contributed to and helped shape the program. And really, the art of writing is a collaborative effort. And I have one more thanks. I need to thank the friends of Art of Writing, many of whom are themselves writers and alumni of Berkeley. Today, two such friends are present, Matt and Margaret Jacobson. The Jacobsons have generously established the Professor Michael Rogin Art of Writing Endowment, and Professor Banfield and Michael Rogin's daughter are here today. And that endowment has made this lecture series possible. Inspired by the pedagogical passions of his father, political science professor Norman Jacobson, and by his longtime colleague Michael Rogin, Matt will now speak to us about how he has united father, colleague, friend, and art of writing. Thank you, Matt.
So on my way over here, I just realized that it's been 49 years since my last literature class at Cal. So don't be so tough on me. Although I did grow up in an academic home, so I was graded every day. So I'm here to provide a little background on how my wife Margaret and I became passionate supporters of the Doreen Townsend Center for the Humanities and its wonderful Michael Rogin Art of Writing program. The story really began when my father joined the faculty of the UC Berkeley Political Science Department in 1951. He continued to teach on campus until his death in 2007. During his career, he was an unusual breed of educator, focusing on the humanities side of the social science field that he was in. He was multidisciplinary and did not let academic boundaries define him. He inspired and entertained generations of students with his lectures, which were really essays that he would write in longhand on yellow legal paper. Oddly, I heard at a Townsend Center event yesterday that using an essay to deliver a lecture is not recommended. I guess my dad didn't get the memo. After he died, my family was introduced to the Townsend Center as a place on campus where his legacy and passion as a teacher could be passed down to future generations of students. Paul Alpers, the founding director of the Townsend Center and the late husband of Chancellor Carol Christ, in describing the center's benefactor, Doreen Townsend, wrote that she was, quote, prepared to discover that the faculty, the students, and the center were doing some unusual and on occasion incomprehensible thing. My dad would have fit right in. So prior to the COVID lockdown, Margaret and I had the pleasure of being introduced to an unusual program at the Townsend Center, The Art of Writing. It is designed to help students learn how to take their written voices to a higher level. We attended an event like this one, and we were impressed by the elegance of the program and the passion of those involved, both the instructors and the students. A few years later, Then Arts and Humanities Dean Anthony Cascardi, a former director of the Townsend Center himself, asked if we would help with funding for the program. We jumped at the chance. But there was one catch. We wound up with program naming rights. In a bit of a panic, I rifled through my mental Rolodex until I reached the R's, which is where I found Michael Rogin. Mike was my father's colleague in poli-sci and a close friend. He was a beloved lecturer, inspirational teacher, and an accomplished writer. He too worked outside traditional norms of academia by following his own humanist and multidisciplinary path. It is our hope that everyone who becomes aware of the Michael Rogin Art of Writing program has the curiosity to learn about him and find something inspirational in his work. The Townsend Center and the Michael Rogin Art of Writing program are unusual gems in the UC Berkeley community. Hopefully, though, not too incomprehensible. We are blessed to have them here. And please sit back and enjoy one of the benefits. Thank you.
I know this is a little unusual, but I haven't been here since 2019, so I want to briefly introduce our guest today, about whom we're going to learn much more during our conversation today. Sonali Deraniyagala is an economist by training. Her research focuses on economic development, including post-disaster recovery and extreme climate change. And she is, as many of you already know, the author of the memoir Wave, which recounts her experiences of catastrophic loss of family and friends during the 2004 Sri Lanka tsunami. Hailed as a, quote, quiet memoir of torturous loss, Joan Didion, herself a memoirist of extraordinary talents, understatement, called it an amazing, beautiful book. Sonali will today speak to us about the very act and art of writing Wave. My students reminded me last week that grief and grieving are messy. They voiced their amazement at how exquisitely composed and precise was Sonali's language in describing this state. So I'm going to ask a few questions, and then my Rhetoric 121 students who have been working hard to prepare questions will then continue the interview with their very thoughtful and exciting comments. Allow me to welcome Sonali to the stage.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Ramona, for inviting me, and to the Art of Writing program for hosting me. Thank you. My pleasure to be here entirely.
Thank you. So before we discuss your Art of Writing Wave, I want to talk to you about your other life, as it were. You're an economist. You've written a best-selling memoir, which has been praised for its exquisite style and narration. So I'm wondering, how has your style of writing and thinking as an economist changed since Wave? And conversely, how was your identity as an economist influencing your style? I know that there's a younger generation of social scientists and STEM students in the audience. I know one, in fact, very well, would be keen to know why and how they should care about their writing style and communication skills.
I'll take your middle question first.
Okay.
How was Wave influenced by me being an economist? I don't know if it was, to be honest, firstly. I'm not sure if writing a memoir, economics, one thing I got from economics is precision, I would say. But here I was writing a memoir about the most imprecise thing you can ever imagine. So it was the antithesis of precision. So I was, the reason I wrote, if I go back a little, there's many reasons I wrote. Firstly, I'm an accidental writer. So I've never intended to write a book. So that was, and I was writing essentially for myself. I was writing to make sense of, firstly, what had happened. It was, it was kind of beyond I couldn't grasp it, so I had to firstly put down very basic things like what happened and what happened to me when I was in the water and what did I remember, and kind of really strange things like being taken by the water and seeing a flock of birds flying overhead and being so surreal that I kind of identified what kind of birds they were. So that kind of bizarre observation I wrote to put that down just for myself, so that I thought maybe one day. And all of this time I was also ambivalent about, am I going to stay alive? I mean, I was determined almost not to stay alive. So I was writing in this kind of, so that was the beginning of writing. Later on, I think this changed as time went on over the years. So I took about 7, 8 years to write it, and I wrote it also in real time as I went along, as to how I was, what I was experiencing, processing, and so on. And when I began, after some point, and also kind of loss of this scale, again, one can't write easily or put into sentences or find words for. But when I began to craft it, after a point, again, it was essentially for myself, but I began to write what turned out to be chapters, but they were not meant to be chapters, but pieces that I would craft. And I would try and find the best way to express it, to find my voice, as it were. And so that may be my, thinking as an economist came in there, the precision with which to find the best word to kind of talk about.
Is that what you mean when you say you were trying to find your voice? I'm interested in how you understand that.
It's a very instinctive thing, isn't it? A voice when you write, I think it's totally instinctive. I know when it sounds wrong, then you know when it sounds right. I'm not I haven't done any courses in writing, or, I'm not trained as a writer in any way, as many people are, but I don't even think that matters, really. So, it was, you kind of know when it sounds right, but you don't get to that point very easily. It takes a lot of work to get to the point where it sounds right. So for students who are studying writing, I think, they're blessed to be trained in it, but secondly, it's kind of how do you hit that note? And you take all the falsity out of your voice. I think that's when it sounds right. You take the pretension out, and then it sounds, and it should be as clear as possible. I mean, that's the other thing, is clarity. And I think Vivian Gornick, who I've kind of, read a lot now since I wrote my memoir, and she's a brilliant memoir, and she writes about, not only is she a brilliant memoirist, she writes about writing so well. And she says it's not what has happened to the writer that matters, it's how the writer figures out what has happened to them, what they make of it. And I think it's what they make of it, and that's a real challenge. How do you make something of? And I did most of it kind of subconsciously, I didn't set out to do it, but it had its own dynamic. So,
and maybe you can talk a little bit more about why people in other disciplines should think about their style of writing. And I agree with you, voice comes intuitively, but there must have been things you were reading or listening to that somehow formed your intuition about.
Yeah,
I mean, there must have been an education that happened through your reading practices.
Sure. I mean, at the time I was writing, I was mainly reading fiction and poetry. I wasn't that much of a nonfiction reader, and I certainly hadn't read memoir, and I wasn't really even interested in reading memoir. So fiction and poetry, as opposed to, and I read a lot of politics and economics because I'm an economist, but in terms of, material or the way I learned to write, I had to teach myself to write, and I was aware of it. And primarily, I think, through reading a lot of fiction and contemporary fiction, which now I'm not really, I don't read that much, but contemporary fiction and a lot of poetry and some nonfiction, but mainly. So it was an education. Yeah, I had to kind of learn and educate myself. But I think you find any writer that, writes lucidly. For students, if you're an engineering student, you should read, I say, Natalia Ginsburg, Italian writer who was writing in the 1950s, and no one can write a lucid sentence as she can. So, I mean, I think, if you want to write an engineering manual, read Natalia Ginsburg, and you can, that would help you. So I think, there is a lot of, cross-fertilization and where you train your mind. Or if you want to be a poet, study maths that could work. So it kind of depends where you can draw your inspiration from or your training from, anywhere in a way, as long as it's within.
So I know you told me you've been teaching on extreme climate change, and that's obviously a very different way of thinking about the tsunami. If you had to write about what you're teaching, do you think you would you keep your voice, the more so-called objective voice that, say, you used when you would be writing reports, or would you try to somehow put in your lyrical literary voice?
No, I don't at all put in a
No, you don't.
No, I mean, I teach a course called Extreme Climate or Disasters and Economic Development. And I teach it jointly with an earth scientist, with a seismologist. So he does the physics of hurricanes, earthquakes, floods, droughts, and all of that, and climate science. And I do the post effects, the social, political effects of it. So when of course, when you teach, and even in economics, I mean, I always say an economic model is also a story. And there's a narrative to an economic model. So in that way, I try to make it as interesting as possible because, we all know when we're teaching, you want to bring it alive for students. So I do try so I always start my class with this example of so-called witch killings in Tanzania, which is a killing of elderly women by family members, which happened in the early 2000s in Tanzania. And the rate of witch killings really went up in the early 2000s, I'll tell you very quickly, compared to the other murder rates, regular murder rates. So the question is, why was this? Was this purely, a patriarchal kind of violence, or was there something else going on? And what some sociologists found out is that really it had to do with extreme weather. Too much rain and too little rain caused a scarcity of food, which led to murder of elderly women within the family. So I always say witch killings, and my students look, what's that got to do with anything? And then, of course, when you explain it, then you set the tone in a way for how do we kind of break open these phenomena and look at it through a more analytical lens. But so that's kind of an extreme case of,
Well, like you said, you tell them a story.
You tell them a story. You tell them a story.
Which you did.
Yeah.
Which you did with WAVE, and I'll change now in that direction. So it's been 20 years since the tsunami in Sri Lanka, and it's been more than 10 years since you published WAVE. And I know you've told the story many times about how you came to write WAVE, and the students will be asking you more about that. But I want to ask you a little bit of a different question. In an interview, you once said that there was a passage that neither you or anyone else edited or revised, which is an amazing feat as far as I can tell. So was that an act of magical inspiration? Was there something, because the passage, if I understood correctly, is when you first go back to your home in London in 2008. And it had taken you a while to get back there, and you enter into the house and you start seeing everything was the same as it had been. And I think that's the passage, that chapter, that you went home to New York and you just wrote it.
Yes, well, I wrote, so I didn't go back to our family home for 4 years. I was in Sri Lanka when it happened, and eventually I found my way to New York. And I would, even when I went to England, I wouldn't visit the house. I hardly went to London. I'd stay with people elsewhere, and so on. So then suddenly 4 years later, I said, okay, I'm going to go back. And I did. And I went and I spent 2 days. I didn't stay in the house, I think. And I came back and I wrote, my experience of being there. It was like 4 pages or something. And when I say I didn't change it, I mean, when I write very slowly, and I write changing and editing a lot as I go along. So, maybe I took a month to write it. Maybe I took 2-3 weeks to write it. It's not like I sat down and just wrote it.
Not like
I
Rilke.
chiseled it. I do chisel. I write it very slowly. I kind of get it right. So once I did that, and I was okay with it eventually, and then, so maybe I wrote it sometime in 2008, and I didn't, it didn't become a book until 2012. I hadn't touched it, and my editors didn't touch it either. So in that way, it was untouched. but I do my self-editing a lot. So I'm a terrible writer. I mean, it takes a long time to get, good sentences down, or kind of that's good enough for me at least.
So I'm wondering, because we often use the dictum to our story, to our students, that good writing is rewriting.
Sure.
And I'd like you to talk to us a little bit more in detail about your revision process, and also if there's a passage in Wave that you wish you could rewrite.
Revision process is quite hard. I mean, that is where intuition, I think, two things when you're writing even memoir. A memoir is not really about what happened, right? It's got to have some kind of, I think, analytical thread running through it. So each piece, you're trying to arrive at something or explore something or explode something for yourself. You're kind of digging around. And I often, can begin with the last sentence or the first sentence that comes to me as so like a hook to hang it in. And then I have, then you digress and you come back. So for me, at least, it's going somewhere. It's got some kind of end. So that's one, the revision process. So that takes a lot of time. And then at the editing stage of my book, Sunny Mehta Knoffi edited.
Will you tell the audience a little bit about, because I don't know. I guess he didn't die until 20.
No,
so
he just
had
died
many
2 years
authors
ago.
after you.
Yes. He was a great, great editor, and so he was my primary editor at Knopf, and I had a Canadian editor too. So the two of them. And so the editing process, by the time I gave it to them, I'd self-edited so much that it was quite light. They changed, a few words here and there. There was no big chapter change or nothing major at all. So it's, for me, entirely pleasurable. I called it The Wave, and he took the out. And I was like, "No, Sonny, I think that sounds better." And he just completely ignored me. So that.
Do you remember any of other of the editorial?
Very light things. And then my Canadian editor, she was great too. She asked for stuff that I'd written that I had taken out myself, because when I told her that I'd, because it was so kind of pared down when I gave it to them, and she added little bits in. So some of my kind of, discards came back in as well. So that was, editing was great fun, because for me anyway, it was quite a nice process. So.
And you also worked with another writer, right, when you were writing the...
Yeah, well, I was very lucky, because, literally I didn't know a single writer. I'm an economist, so I didn't know anybody who wrote books or even a fiction writer. I had a very small group of friends, and my therapist in New York, Mark Epstein, he was my primary reader always. It's he who told me, "You should write." And I'm like, "Are you nuts? I'm not going to write." But he kind of cajoled me gradually into writing. So a lot of the chapters came out of discussions. We'd work on something, or we talk about, it wasn't even work. It was really, talking about this feeling of shame, for instance, and why not guilt, why shame, and talking about that a lot. And then I'd write something. So he was always, so I read somewhere that, you always write for one person. And he was probably the primary ear I wrote. And I had a group of 3 friends, say, anthropologists. They were kind of just my friends. They were not writers. And they read, so each thing, I'd write, and then they would read it, and we would move on from there. And so after many years, the writer Michael Rogin, the Canadian Sri Lankan writer, I'd met him at dinner at my friend's house in New York. And, we got on really well, but that was that. And I didn't dare tell him that I was writing. And then later, my friend said, "Oh, you got to send this to Michael. He will." I just asked him. So I kind of, "Oh dear, Michael, remember me?" kind of email. And I said, "I've been writing with you." And he said, "Oh, send me 30 pages," which I did. And then he was in the middle of a book, and he said, "Oh no, I'll definitely get to it." And finally, he did. And he said, "Have you got any more?" So I sent him, everything I had. I said, "I've got the whole thing." And he was so great. He told me, "Come to Toronto, like tomorrow," kind of thing. So I went a few days later. And he sat with me, and we went through this manuscript. I didn't even know it was called a manuscript then. So we went through it. And he gave me the most important note. I think one note I took away was that don't repeat the same emotion twice. Yeah, and always be ahead of the reader. And he took out a few swear words. And he said, I so remember, he said, yeah. And so I kind of took that away with me, and I kind of, combed it again and kind of looked at it and looked at it maybe 6 months later. And he said, send it back. And when I sent it back, he said, there's nothing more. And he gave me his agent, and then that was it.
So I'm curious, did you repeat certain emotions in the first draft? And
I guess
do
I
you
did, right?
Do you remember which ones they were,
can't.
other than swearing?
Yeah, he said too many fucks, he said. So I took that out. I remember
So the
that.
anger was repeated over and over
a
again?
lot. But I took, and to be ahead of the reader. So
what does that mean exactly, to be ahead of the
because,
reader?
emotion, even grief is many faceted, right? There's grief and there's grief and there's different aspects to it. So don't repeat, boring old grief. Go to a newer one and another one and another, another angle to it. And that's, and becomes interesting even for you, if not you're saying the same thing. So you kind of, deeper or sideways or whichever way you go. So I think, and just, here and there we kind of took it out. Not much, but that was a very good note. He told me this thing, and that's good for students of writing as well. He, and I've read this book, it's called The Conversations, where it's between Michael Ondaatje and Walter Murch, who's a film editor. He did all the great films. And Walter Murch said that I don't know which movie it was in, but the director wanted blue light. So they filmed the whole scene with blue light, and it just didn't work. And then after a point, he said, the editor said, take out the blue light. And you take out the blue light, and somehow the blue light is still there. Because somehow, it's got infused into the situation. So that, even when it comes to writing, you can take something out. You can take a lot out. And, whatever you need to say is still there. So.
And you were not fearful cutting all the time things out?
No,
I mean, it didn't feel like you were, no.
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to switch the topic very dramatically and then open it up to my students. But so I feel like it's inevitable today to talk to you about AI and writing and algorithmic writing and your thoughts about it, about authorship, about human-centric authorship, AI, authorship, collaborative authorship. Vahuni Vara's 2021 publication of Ghosts in the Believer specifically addresses this issue of collaborative authorship. She had been unable to write about the death of her sister, and she turned to ChatGPT to help her write the story. And her need of AI was to help her voice her grief. I'm curious what thoughts you might have about it, because I know you struggled so fiercely one-on-one with your grief that to bring another element in. And I just want to read you how she begins her her story. I had always avoided writing about my sister's death. At first, in my reticence, I offered GPT only one brief, somewhat rote sentence about it. AI matched my canned language, cliches abounded. But as I tried to write more honestly, AI seemed to be doing the same.
I'd hate that. I mean, really, I just could not. Yikes.
Tell us more, because we're all, as professors and writers, this AI, ChatGPT, has entered into our lives.
You can use a human, right? You can ask somebody to, we all know someone that we can talk to. I don't know, in terms of creative writing, or, an essay on, how do hurricanes affect GDP growth in Puerto Rico between 1990 and 1997, say. You could maybe ask AI to get some information on that. But if you're writing anything more meaningful or many kind of creative or, creative nonfiction, poet, I don't know how. I'm too old maybe, but I'd hate the thought of going to AI. But we go to the internet, of course. We read poetry. We read other things too. And there's a lot out there that we don't need to, what do we do when you want to figure out an emotion? We can go read, Joan Didion, or we can read poetry, or we can read, any other kind of, lots of fantastic nonfiction. We can find it. We can read Shakespeare. There is material there, but I personally wouldn't know how to access AI to do that.
And you would have no desire.
I would have absolutely no desire to, no. because I would need a human interaction or a kind of, or other kind of books, literatures, journals, whatever. But that's just me. And maybe
well,
in
we're
20
interested in you today.
Yeah.
We're
So I
interested
couldn't. I
in
mean, I
your-
can't think of anything worse. I mean, I'd hate the. I can't. And less personal, and I don't know. It's kind of, I don't want to be judgmental, but almost dishonest, isn't it? Because if you're writing about yourself.
Well, we're going to be talking next week about authenticity and AI. So when you say it's dishonest, I'm sorry, you don't have to come to class.
No.
When you say it's dishonest, what exactly?
No, I mean lacking authenticity somewhere. But maybe people know to use it in better ways, and I don't know much about it, so maybe.
Well, maybe
But
some of
how
the
do
students
you-
will talk to you
yeah,
about their
yeah.
experience.
I mean, certain things you can use it for, I guess. If you're writing an essay on something pretty technical, to start you off, you might use, you need 2 sentences, but then you surely should think of those 2 sentences yourself. I mean, it's not that difficult to, if you're kind of at Berkeley or, Columbia, that you can do. So why do you need, So I don't know. It's all, but I'm a Luddite maybe on this. So, yes.
Well, I won't have you keep talking about it.
Yeah.
I'll have you talk about, wave.
Yeah.
I know you keep telling us you wrote this wave to your therapist, to yourself. You dedicated the book to your children's best friends to tell them the story. I'm sure you had in mind people who have gone through these type of catastrophes also, that you wanted to kind of reach out to them in a way. You didn't know them. It was an unknown audience. But I recently heard an interview. There's a new memoir being written that's going to come out by a Palestinian who's in prison he's been accused of murder. And the opening of the book is all about the wall. And so the interviewer, who's a Lacanian psychoanalyst, which is why she asked this question, was, are you speaking to the wall as the symbolic other that is going to send back a message to you? I'm not going to ask that question. And I actually... I don't even know what the symbolic other was, or could be. But I do want to know about how you were you addressing wave? I kept looking and I saw there was no definite or indefinite article. Did it go from a wave to the wave to wave? I mean, were you talking to the wave also?
No.
Never.
Never. No, no, not at all. I mean, the wave was the wave was the wave. It didn't, what mattered was the loss. It could have been a tree. It was just happened to be the wave. And that's the way I looked at it anyway. I wasn't that interested in, how it happened. It was more this bizarre, kind of otherworldly situation where I had a life, I didn't have a life, and it took 10 minutes between the two. So it was that I was trying to figure out. And I think the whole book, Wave, was trying to, everything vanishes in an instant, literally in an instant, with no warning. It's not like, even an accident, what an accident is. I'd never heard the word tsunami before. And Sri Lanka's not been a coastline that had, it's not an earthquake, we're not on any fault lines. There was not, we never had tsunamis in the known history of Sri Lanka. So it's like, I kind of experienced something that I didn't have words for. I didn't know what was happening when it was happening, which is why I was sure I was dreaming. I was really, when I was in that wave, I was 100% sure I was dreaming because, what was this? So, no, I wasn't addressing it to a wave or the wave. It didn't really matter how. Once it had happened, the how didn't matter to me at all. It was like, now what do I do? And that was what mattered. And
so now the editor in me is really curious. Did you choose your title?
Like I said, I sent it to him with the wave, and he took out, and Sonny took out the word the.
I see. Okay, yes, I see now. Excuse
but it was
me.
very hard to title. I mean, we did try and think of other things, but we just left it in that way, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm going to turn it over now to Rhetoric 121. All of them are, most of them are sitting over there. And our first, Dimitri is going to open with a question. Dimitri, could you stand up? And I think I'm going to bring you the mic for now. Thank you very much.
Hi.
Hi, Dimitri.
Thank you, first of all, for coming out today for this amazing discussion. We noticed while reading that you alternate between past and present tenses quite frequently. You often break the chronology throughout the narration, invoking visions from before the wave and blending moments in time. So we were curious about, was this alternating between tenses and moments or memories a decision you made while you were writing the book, or did it come about while you were revising or working with your editor?
That's a lovely question. Thank you. That's just the way I wrote it. It didn't, for sure, it didn't come out of revisions. And I guess I was, it was the mind that's speaking to myself. Right? And so that it's kind of, at any point in time, we are always shifting between, if you follow your thoughts always shift between going back and now, back and now. And I think I was trying to be true to that. And, certainly in certain chapters and in certain places, we're here now, but then, you're talking about something and he did that and I'm doing this. And so it was some way of, because, I also had to kind of figure out, suddenly why did my present become my past? So it was, as far as I was concerned, it was almost still my present. And it had suddenly had to become, it was enforced to become, forcibly became a past. So I think maybe subliminally, that's probably why as well. I don't know. But now that you ask me and I'm thinking about it, it could be that's why, and I just left it, it felt right. Basically, a lot of it is what I felt was okay. So, and it felt right, and I left it.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Do you want to hand the mic to Amber?
Hi.
Hi.
When you encountered the sheet of laminated paper on the beach, it prompted a question about memory and how you frame it as fearful to remember, but also fearful to forget. A few sentences capture your shift in the mindset. After finding that page, I was no longer afraid of chancing upon our belongings amid this rubble. Now I am wanted to discover more. Living, remembering, and writing about a specific memory is complicated to depict. How did your memory of the specific experience transform in each instance?
How did my memory transform? See, when I wrote, that was an incident where I went back to where it happened. And I went with my father-in-law. And my father-in-law said, I want to stand here under a tree for a moment. And he went and stood under the tree. And when I went back to him, he said, oh, something fluttered by his foot on the tree. And he looked it up, and it was a laminated sheet of paper from a report. And he said, is this something of Steve's and my husband's? And I looked at it, and he was an econometrician. And it was, it was so this was, in the midst of all the devastations. About 6 months later, there'd been a monsoon. There's been, the rubble had been moved and all of that had happened. So I then described that in the book, right? And so when I was writing that, all I can say now is I was just trying to be true to what happened and true to, how exactly it happened and what I felt at the time. So, yes, so, with huge, colossal trauma like this, memory is you're terrified of remembering. I think most people are. You don't want to remember the good. The bad is not so bad to remember, like the wave itself is not so. I'm not traumatized by water or anything like that, the ocean or anything. But I didn't find any of that traumatic, or was not triggered or any of this. But what triggered you was good things, like a tennis ball or a cricket bat or, nice thing, that would be joy would be more traumatic. So this thing of trying to cut off, trying to shut down memory, and then memory comes bursting in with objects like this. So that was what I was trying to kind of capture, because I think lots of people go through that as well when you're trying to shut out reality. And then, of course, it comes kind of bounding in. And
Thank you.
yeah.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Anish.
In class, we've been discussing the use of memoirs as tools to examine our own inner lives and how an author constructs a character while reflecting and writing about memories. Over the years since Wave's publication, how has your relationship to the person you portrayed in Wave changed
That's a good
as
question.
your life's progressed and evolved? Does the memoir serve to bring you closer to the person you were at that time, or do you feel a distance from them?
Good question. Very good. I haven't thought about that, actually. Yeah, it's very good.
I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah. Well, like a lot of writers, a lot of writers don't read the book they wrote ever again. And I haven't looked at it for 10 years. I don't know what's in there.
I think a lot of professors feel the same way.
Yeah, right. So, I think John Banville, the novelist, I read an interview with him where he says whenever a book comes out, he wants to go into every bookstore and erase the entire book. That's his urge is, oh my God, I wish I can go in at night and, take away all the words and then write it again. So it is that. You don't want to look at what you wrote again. And with memoir, it's even more tricky, right? If there was a person there and is that the same person? And are you embarrassed? And there's so many. But I think you've just got to let the book be and let that person be. And, that was, that person, and it can't be that different from who I am now either. But, it is, I think there's some kind of equilibrium there. You have to allow that book to be, and then, you're going to change as well. That is a problem with, I think, now when I write and try to write memoir. And if I write over time and I look at something I wrote 2 years ago, I go, eeks, because you feel so different even from 2 years ago. So that is a real problem. And sometimes you got to just hold tight and just go with it and just kind of keep writing. So it's kind of, it's...
Ashlyn?
Thank you. So you mentioned writing Wave at the urging of your therapist, but we're interested in learning more about when in your writing process you considered publishing your book. You write a little bit about this in your memoir, and we wanted to learn more. And then as a follow-up, since publishing Wave, have any reactions surprised you? Have any reviews captured your intentions and emotions better than others? And if so, how?
Firstly, when did it become a book? It became a book only a year before it was published. So, I had this collection of materials, and I'd kind of almost made it into chapters. So it was a book, and then I got an agent and a publisher very quickly. So I was very lucky. The first publisher, Knopf, took it. It became a book. So that was, it took, it was bought in August, say, it came out in March, I think, the next year. So it became a book quite, from me not even thinking it'll be a book to becoming a book. So that was, I for one was, very surprised at like the positive kind of response to it, and because I was not a writer, and I didn't feel that I was a writer, or I didn't know how to be a writer. So it was all new to me, and I think, and some reviews you're quite surprised that they get it better than you do. They say, "Wow, really?" So So it was a very kind of positive experience on the whole. And
Thank you.
Well, I think we have a little time for one or two questions from the audience before we have to say goodbye.
I can bring this one over.
Thank you, Ashlyn. Why don't we go to
Hearing about your, excuse me, sorry.
That's all right.
Hearing about your story is very interesting to me, especially how you're training to be were trained to be an economist, especially at one point. I myself was considering to be one. I'm curious now, after you've gone through this experience writing this book, being an economist, do you feel now that your calling was to be a writer, or do you feel some form of equilibrium between the two lives you've led?
Good question. It's actually much easier to be an economist than to be a writer. That is, especially if you're trained in, to be an economist. So that, writing is a very self-conscious act, isn't it? And it's very, I find writing very hard to do because you're always conscious. If you're writing, fiction may be different, but I don't think I can write fiction. But if you're writing anything in the realm of nonfiction where you are part of it, I think that's quite hard to trust it. I think that's a very difficult thing to do. And whereas being an economist is an easy, a relatively easy act. Coming back to my friend Michael Rogin, he has got a very new book of poems out. And I did a Q&A with him last week in New York on the book. And there are some gorgeous poems, and there's one called Definition. And in that, it's about a Sanskrit dictionary, and only a poet can say, looking at words in a Sanskrit dictionary, there's a word for an alcove where coin washers sit and the fingers are glinting in silver and so on. And he's got a line in there which says, definitions push open everywhere you look. Definitions push open a door. Now that's in poetry, in fiction, in in even creative nonfiction. And for economists, I said to him, it's completely opposite. We use definitions to bolt the door shut so that, it's really kind of what we are saying is very precise. And so it's a very different way of thinking. But, if I say write about, I don't know, poverty rates in South Sudan, between 2000 and 2005, you're only going to write about poverty rates. If you write about inequality, I didn't ask you about inequality, so we are using definitions and we are bolting the door shut, whereas here is a case of opening doors, and I think there's kind of a difference there. So.
Full disclosure, questions you were asked were workshop. This one isn't. So forgive me, but I hope you'll appreciate the honesty. You've mentioned throughout the discussion that in memoir, it's not what happened, but what someone made out of the experience that matters. And I wrote that down specifically thinking about part 1 in your memoir, where you're in the hospital and you're almost hesitant to even acknowledge questions about the experience and almost refusing to talk about it because it would have an impact on the reality of what was happening. And you mentioned that you were, in effect, trying to shut out reality. But there was a specific passage in part 1 where you started looking up images of tsunamis and videos of these things to make it real, you mentioned in your memoir. So I'm wondering, did seeing these images add a deeper layer to what you were feeling and help you in the grieving process? And then furthermore, as you were writing and you published, did writing about this experience ever establish a disconnect between you and the experience, perhaps by talking about it too much and it becoming almost a narrative? I'm interested in that relationship between the conversation and reality.
Great question. Very good. Looking at images, I think probably it's quite a superficial thing. It doesn't deepen your understanding of what happened. And I think, so probably not. I mean, that was just, something you do because you don't know what else to do in that moment, So you kind of look at images and, I'm sure people who go through various kind of, violent situations may seek images and so on. So that was, I would say, it doesn't do anything. Might make it a bit more real, but probably not, because your idea of it is very different to a photographer's idea of what happened. You never see a tsunami like they show in a photograph because that's taken from a different place and so on. Does it make you detach from by writing about it? Actually, I'd say it makes you attach more rather than detach. Because, to write about it deeply, or to write about anything deeply, you really have to get close to it and descend and descend and descend. And so, I did it to the best of my ability. I really did get, really trying to recall, what exactly did it feel like, what exactly, it was, and kind of noting. I noted down things very early on, not knowing that I'm going to use it for anything, just for my own kind of sake, that, oh God, this kind of completely biblical, otherworldly thing happened to me. Let me just at least write some basic, comments about what happened. So I think, and it's very important just as a human being to attach to these experiences in a way, rather than, that's my feeling, detach from it, because then that kind of, makes you not bond with it, but understand it in a deeper way. And it kind of, you cohere rather than be this disjointed person that cannot cope with this or that. Or so I find personally I had to cohere with the worst reality on the planet, and that was what enabled me to stand up again. So that was
Thank you.
yeah.
We have one last question here.
Someone.
Brian, you want?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi. Thank you very much. My question concerns adaptation. How would you feel if your work was adapted for theater, a movie, TV, etc.? How would you feel about that? And if you did go forward with that, what would be your motivation, knowing that the work is very personal?
Actually, I had a blanket no to any adaptation.
Okay.
So from the moment the book came out, and I also didn't do any press. I didn't do any kind of talk shows or interviews. Or I did like a couple of interviews. I think one with the Guardian, but I was really protected from all of that. So no, I'd hate to see it adapted.
Thank you.
Well, thank you everyone for being here, and thank you, Sonali, for coming this whole. Thank you so much. Have a good evening, everyone. Thank you.